The Clone Wars were one of the most destructive conflicts in galactic history, and they completely transformed galactic civilization. By war's end, both of the belligerents, the Galactic Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, had been toppled, and a new galactic empire had risen to take their place. A new chapter of history had begun. For the next 20 years, the Empire would rule the galaxy, but it didn't rule unchallenged. Years before the start of the Galactic Civil War, the Empire found itself embroiled in another major war, one you might not have even heard of, the reconquest of the Rim. This saw the Empire pitted against a collection of Separatist holdouts, and it was essentially a second round of the Clone Wars, an epilogue for the Separatist crisis. In this video, we're going to be telling the full story of this crucial conflict that shaped the emerging empire.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Over the course of the Clone Wars, the Republic transformed, and by war's end, it had officially been declared the Galactic Empire. This empire inherited control over much of the galaxy from the Republic, as well as the Republic's powerful clone army and vast military-industrial complex. But the Empire didn't take over the galaxy overnight. While the deactivation of the CIS droid army at the end of the war had allowed the now Imperial clone army to occupy the most important parts of Separatist territory, other Separatist sectors remained unconquered. And beyond those sectors, in the depths of the Outer Rim, were places where the Republic had never existed to begin with, the domains of Hutts and pirates which the rulers of the new empire wanted to crack down on. As a result, the empire would spend the first 2 years of its existence waging wars of conquest in the Outer Rim, fighting separatists and criminals to lay claim to those distant territories. It was during these campaigns that the Empire truly established itself as the ruling power of the entire galaxy. Before the Clone Wars, Republic authority had only ever been theoretical across most of the Outer Rim, even the parts of it that lay within Republic space. The Clone Wars began to change that, as the later stages of the conflict saw Republic forces establish a presence in many of those regions, particularly along the ends of major hyperspace routes. These Republic military occupations were the beginning of full incorporation into the Empire, but they were only the beginning. Empires, after all, aren't stagnant entities. They have to expand, to constantly seek out new territory and resources. Their vast militaries need a steady supply of new enemies to justify their existence. Not necessarily enemies they intend on fighting, but threats that the people will accept as a cause to maintain a massive armed force for possible use against. The reconquest of the Rim provided all that. It opened up new territories for the Empire to expand into and extract resources from, and it put a spotlight on the boogeyman that the Imperial military would use to justify its bloated size, one that the people of the Empire had already been propagandized against: the Separatists. At the end of the Clone Wars, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was officially dissolved, and its droid armies were deactivated by the Separatist Council shortly before Darth Vader massacred them. The Confederacy's major strongholds were occupied by the Empire, and the corporations that had built its droid armies were nationalized and liquidated, with the exception of the intergalactic banking clan. But that wasn't the end of the Separatists. The people who had created the Separatist movement to begin with were still out there, many in sectors that were still unconquered, and those Separatists didn't care if the corporations had surrendered or not. They were determined to continue resisting the Empire, which they saw as the inevitable final evolutionary stage of the Republic, the same tyranny they had been fighting all along. These Separatist holdouts were determined to not go quietly into that good night. Instead, they armed up, laying claim to abandoned CIS assets and digging in for a siege. And a siege is exactly what they got. For the next 2 years, the Empire waged total war against these holdouts. Once more, the clone army took to the battlefield against Separatist battle droids. While the most skilled of the clones were tasked with completing the Great Jedi Purge, most of the clone troopers still in service after the end of the war were assigned to this campaign, and many relished a chance to finish off their hated Separatist enemies once and for all. The reconquest of the Rim was technically a galactic-scale war, just like the Clone Wars had been, but it almost entirely took place in the Mid and Outer Rims, divided into 6 highly publicized campaigns. For those in the coreward regions of the galaxy, these campaigns were distant and heavily romanticized, framed by Imperial holovision as the glorious expansion of human civilization into the savage, Separatist-held wilds of the Rim. But despite its smaller scale, the reconquest of the Rim was about as significant for the Empire as the first Clone Wars, especially as far as propaganda value went. It had similar significance to the remaining Separatists, who saw it simply as an extension of the Clone Wars, the last desperate stage of their fight against tyranny. We've got a map of the galaxy as it was at this time on screen now, with the Empire's territory as it was just after the Clone Wars marked out in red. We'll be coming back to this map throughout this video as we look at each of these 6 campaigns in turn. The reconquest of the Rim picked up right where the Clone Wars had left off, beginning in the latter half of 19 BBY, with 3 campaigns. The largest of these was known as the Ciutric Offensive, and it sprawled across the Empire's northern frontier out into the new territories. During the Outer Rim sieges, Republic offensives in this region had mostly been aimed at Megiddo and a number of other banking clan strongholds along the Braxant Run. These systems were conquered by the Empire after the droid army was shut down and the IGBC came under Imperial control, but many Mun leaders escaped, fleeing across the void of Chapani to the still unconquered Ciutric sector. Other Separatist forces fleeing Munilinst, Megiddo, and the other conquered Separatist worlds in the region followed, as did other Separatist forces fleeing the other way from the newly conquered Outer Hydian, and the Ciutric sector became a rallying point for Separatist holdouts in the new territories. Under the leadership of Mun ex-IGBC executives, these Separatists allied with a few local pirate gangs and the infamous Thalassian slavers, and wealthy interests on Imperial-controlled Sereno and Selenon secretly provided them with funding and additional mercenaries. They carved out a small swath of Separatist territory beyond the borders of Imperial space on the edge of the void of Chapani. Bin Quaros became these renegades' headquarters while joint Separatist pirate fleets rallied to defend their territory at Bamil and Thalassia. The Mun Separatists were determined to resist the Empire to the end, and the Empire was determined to make an example of them. The Empire's 10th Sector Army, which had occupied the Outer Hydian at the end of the war, was assigned to deal with the Ciutric Sector renegades. Within weeks of the end of the Clone Wars, a massive task force was rallied for the offensive at Axila, and it was placed under the command of 2 Clone Wars-era Republic heroes, Admiral Terranald Screed and General Hurst Ramodi. Screed's task force of Venator and Victory-class Star Destroyers smashed the holdouts' fleet at Vinsoth and pushed on to Bin Quaros, where the Mun leaders of the Ciutric sector holdout were pinned down and subjected to a long siege. In orbit of Bin Quaros, Screed again routed the Separatist fleet, which fled rimward to Bamil, allowing the Empire to blockade Bin Quaros. There, Ramodi went to ground, where he and his clone troopers fought a grueling campaign against Separatist ground forces. They steadily gained ground, smashing the Mun's armies of battle droids and mercenaries, and as Ramodi made progress on Bin Quaros, Screed pursued the Separatists' fleet to Bamil. There, the Separatists' remaining Munificent-class star frigates and Commerce Guild destroyers were joined by a Thalassian privateer fleet, but Screed's armada utterly routed them all the same. Bamil fell, and within short order, the Ciutric Sector Separatists' fleet was all but destroyed. With Ramodi slowly making progress on Bin Quaros, it seemed the Ciutric Offensive would soon be over. It was then that, for the first time, but certainly not the last time, the Empire got in its own way. While all of this was going on, an unrelated Imperial task force had been waging war against a coalition of pirates and Mandalorians out near Mandalorian space on the other side of the Hydian Way. These outlaws had been routed in a series of battles along the Salin corridor at Phaenion, Findar, and Sheris, but this only drove them right into the rear lines of Screed and Ramodi's forces. The 10th Army sent out a fleet to crush them at Botajef, but the Mandalorians and pirates defeated it, escaping into the Ciutric sector. After their victory at Botajef, the Ciutric Separatists' wealthy backers on Sereno and Selenon hired these pirates to break the siege of Binkoros, and, supported by an additional force of mercenaries, they did exactly that. Since Screed's fleet was away at Bemil, this mercenary force was easily able to break the blockade of Binkoros and throw Ramodi's lines into chaos. This wasn't enough to prevent the planet from falling to the Empire, but it allowed the Separatist leaders and the tattered remnants of their forces to escape the siege. They fled across Imperial space, intending to hide out in the unknown regions, but they were sold out to the Empire by one of their pirate allies, allowing Screed and Ramodi to intercept them at Vardos IV. The assaults on Vardos IV put an end to the Ciutric sector Separatists, and the Ciutric Offensive ended in an Imperial victory, allowing the Empire to expand further into the new territories in the years to come. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the galaxy, the remnants of the Trade Federation were getting ready to raise some hell. The deaths of Newt Gunray and Rune Hako on Mustafar at the end of the Clone Wars had thrown the Trade Federation's upper leadership into chaos, such that in the first days of Imperial rule, command had fallen to a third-rate Trade Federation official on Nemoidia, Centipeth Findos. Findos, as acting viceroy, initially resisted Imperial authority, refusing to acknowledge the Confederacy's defeat and attempting to reactivate the droid army, but his resistance only lasted for a few hours. A few days after the declaration of a new order, Imperial stormtroopers attacked Findos's compound in Kodo Sai and captured the acting viceroy, who, at Blaster Point, signed a treaty turning the Trade Federation and all its resources over to the direct control of the Imperial Senate. The Trade Federation was nationalized and largely liquidated, just as happened to the other major separatist corporations. But a few elements within the Trade Federation refused to acknowledge Findos's treaty, and they became one of the main separatist holdout factions. At Enoch, a key Trade Defense Force military staging hub in the southern Outer Rim, Customs Vizier Marath Vuru declared the nationalization of the Trade Federation illegitimate. He vowed that he and the forces under his command would continue to resist in a public broadcast that was aired on Imperial Holovision. To quote, "Where is Gunray? Where is Hako? A third-tier flunky has no right to negotiate on the Trade Federation's behalf. We have our battleships, we have our droids. If Palpatine wants our wealth, let him come and take it." Many surviving Trade Federation officials rallied to Vuru's banner, leading fleets to Enoch and reactivating several deactivated droid armies. They formed the Trade Federation Resistance, and they set out from Enoch to fortify a small region of space just rimward of Naboo. The Empire promptly dispatched Grand Moff Octavian Grant to put an end to Vuru and his followers, and though the Trade Federation Resistance put up a spirited fight, they were doomed from the beginning. Many Trade Federation executives had flocked to Vuru's banner, but the Trade Federation Resistance didn't have any battle-tested officers, and so Grand Moff Grant had an easy time outmaneuvering and defeating them. In what became known as the Five Veils Campaign, Grant's fleet smashed the Trade Federation Resistance at Farstein, forcing the Vizier and the tattered remnants of his fleet to flee into the depths of the Outer Rim, abandoning Enoch and their other strongholds. Grant pursued the Resistance down the Five Veils Run into wild space, ultimately cornering them at the Hook Nebula. There, the remnants of the Trade Federation fleet were destroyed, Marath Vuru was captured, and the Trade Federation resistance ceased to exist. With it died the last remnants of the Trade Federation, to pretty much no one's great sorrow. The success of this campaign also allowed the Empire to expand into the vast tracts of wild space that lay rimward of Naboo, a region where the Republic had never had more than a handful of remote outposts. The Five Veils campaign was pretty much a cakewalk for the Empire, but the third and final campaign of 19 BBY would be anything but. This was the Sy Myrthian Insurrection, and it pit Imperial forces against one of the most well-armed and persistent Separatist holdouts. This was located in a region that, during the Clone Wars, had become known as the Foundry of the Confederacy, a strip of industrial worlds that made up the core of the Confederacy's military-industrial complex. During the Outer Rim sieges, the Republic was able to tear the heart out of this region thanks to hard-fought battles at Boz-Pity, Jabim, Seleucami, and Felucia, and after the droid army was shut down, the Empire seized much of what remained, occupying the Tyon Cluster, the seat of Separatist political power, which was broken up into several sectors as punishment for its defiance. But one pocket of the Foundry of the Confederacy, located near Hutt Space, remained free of Imperial occupation for long enough that problems arose there. Former Separatist Council member and senator for the Jospro sector, Toonbuk Tura, hadn't been on Mustafar when the other leaders of the CIS were killed, and she wasn't on Raxus when it came under Imperial occupation either. Instead, she fled with a small fleet back to her homeworld of Sy Myrth, gathering a coalition of other surviving Separatist leaders from across the Foundry of the Confederacy as she went. From Sy Myrth, these Separatists reactivated droid army units and reclaimed mech worlds in the southern part of the Foundry, and the Sy Myrthian Insurrection began. Apart from Sy Myrth, itself a powerful industrial world, Tura's Separatists reclaimed the valuable mech worlds Metalorn, Diado, and Trassamen, among others, which promptly began churning out battle droids once again. Toonbuk Tura amassed the largest droid army of any of the Separatist holdouts, supported by ground armor and fleets of Confederate Navy ships, and unlike Marath Vuru, her holdout had the commanders to deploy them effectively. When the Empire moved to crush the Sy Myrth holdout, its clone stormtroopers were in for another round of the Outer Rim sieges, one nearly as grueling, if not as long-lasting, as the first. The task of putting down the Sy Myrthian Insurrection fell to the 12th Sector Army, the long-suffering division that had just spent the last 6 months of the Clone Wars clearing out the rest of the Foundry of the Confederacy. They established a field headquarters at Charos IV, the home of the Geecharians, the designers of the Vulture droid, which had fallen during the Outer Rim sieges. There, General Jen Dodona took command of the 12th Army's ground forces, while command of the fleet fell to Admiral Adar Talon, who led the task force from the bridge of the Praetor-class battlecruiser Battalion. Talon and Dodona pushed into Separatist territory at Diado, where they smashed the vanguard of Tura's forces. After securing Diado, they went on to take Metalorn and then attack Sy Myrth itself. The 12th Army's rearguard swept across Tura's mid-rim holdings, conquering them for the Empire, while General Dodona began a siege of Sy Myrth. Tura, perhaps knowing that this siege wouldn't end well, fled Sy Myrth with a small fleet, but Admiral Talon pursued her to Trassamen, where the remnants of the Separatist fleet turned to face the 12th Army's armada. In the Battle of Trassamen, the battalion destroyed Toonbuk Tura's flagship, the Defiance's banner, and the senator herself was killed. The rest of her fleet met a similar fate, and Sy Myrth succumbed to Dodona's siege not long after. This was more or less the end of the Sy Myrthian Insurrection. With Tura's death and Sy Myrth's fall, the Empire conquered the last piece of the Foundry of the Confederacy, expanding its territory out to the Trielis trade route. But a few surviving Separatist fleets managed to escape into Hutt space after the Battle of Trasmen, and they hid out in the Cretan Narrows, from which they began a campaign of harassment against Imperial forces in the area. This was ultimately fortuitous for the Empire, as it gave an excuse to do something many in the core worlds had been wanting for years: take the Hutts down a peg. The Hutts were everything the humanocentrists who ran the Empire despised. They were a race of human-hating aliens who had vast political and economic power, independence from central rule, and that were the most prominent sponsors of crime and disorder in the galaxy. But not even the Empire was powerful enough to go up against them directly. The Hutts had such power over the galactic economy that, had the Empire tried to conquer Hutt space and break the power of the Hutt cartel, it would have plunged into economic chaos. But the Empire could weaken the Hutts a bit without too much economic fallout, and that's exactly what it did. It had started shortly after the end of the Clone Wars, when the Imperial Senate formally annexed the rimward portions of the vast sphere of influence the Hutts had carved out during the final centuries of Republic rule. This was a process begun during the Clone Wars, when the Republic military had moved into the Hutt-dominated non-Republic sectors along the Outer Corellian Run, and the Empire continued it by laying claim to the worlds of the Trialis trade route and organizing them into sectors. Hutt influence was also driven from Imperial sectors that the Hutts had historically dominated, and by the end of 19 BBY, Hutt space was fully encircled by the Galactic Government's territory for the first time. Separatist activity in the Cretan Narrows allowed the Empire to go a step further and annex the northern parts of Hutt space itself. Foremost of these was the Cretan Narrows, where the remaining Sy Myrthian Separatists were hunted down and quickly destroyed, but it also included Srialur, Bunsar, and the Periphery region, as well as the spice mines of Kessel. The Hutts, for their part, did pretty much nothing about these annexations. They appeased the Empire by recognizing the shift in territory, which satisfied those in the Imperial Senate who wanted to crack down on the Hutts. Then, in true Hutt fashion, the Hutt cartel moved back into the sectors it had just lost, buying out their new governments and regaining control of the local economy, legitimate and illegitimate alike. The Hutts found that the Empire's new sector governors and military rulers were even easier to buy out than the Republic's sector governments had been. Far from fulfilling the New Order's promises of eliminating Republic-era corruption, the unaccountable military rule the Empire put the galaxy under proved to be far more corrupt than the Republic Senate had ever been. Within just a few years, the Hutt cartel had become nearly as powerful as it had been in the Clone Wars, with thousands of Imperial officials in its pocket. Meanwhile, on the other side of Hutt space, the reconquest of the Rim continued. 18 BBY saw 2 additional Imperial campaigns against Separatist holdouts, the first of which took place just off the Corellian Run in the Mid-Rim. There had been a large enclave of Separatist territory on the Corellian Run during the Clone Wars, though one that the Confederacy had only ever had a tenuous grip on. The core of this enclave was a region dominated by the Spivarelda, the authoritarian government of Ando, the Aqualish homeworld. The Aqualish and their partners in the Spivarelda, the spider-like Harch, had been staunch supporters of the Separatist cause, fighting fiercely against Republic forces as they pushed down the Corellian Run. Despite their resistance, the Republic had successfully reclaimed the Corellian Run and conquered Ando by the end of 20 BBY, dismantling the Spivarelda and placing its former holdings under military occupation. But many Aqualish and Harch separatists fought on, carrying out a campaign of guerrilla warfare against Republic forces in the southern slice, attacking supply lines and military outposts alike. When the Republic became the Empire, these raiders kept up the fight, and in 18 BBY, their raids escalated into the Noolian Crisis. With financial support from unknown anti-imperial interests, the Aqualish and Harch separatists began seizing territory in the Noolian sector near the borders of Bothan space. They captured Galberon and Nooli itself, as well as a few outlying Bothan colonies, attempting to carve out a new region of separatist space. They ultimately wouldn't get very far. The Empire was quick to muster a response from the Noolian Crisis, dispatching Captain Pa Lankin with a task force to root out the Separatists. The Aqualish and Harch were defeated by Lankin's fleet in the Battle of Galberon, and the Imperials set about reclaiming the systems the Separatists had seized, including the outlying regions of Bothan space, which were returned to Bothan control. The Noolian Crisis was the briefest of the 6 campaigns of the reconquest of the Rim, but it put an end to one of the Clone Wars' bloodiest conflicts, that between the Separatist aligned Spivarelda of Ando and the Loyalist aligned Andoan Free Colonies. Both sides ultimately lost and came under Imperial occupation, which generally didn't treat the non-human Aqualish very well. This ended the conflict between the two halves of Aqualish society by giving them a bigger enemy to work together against, but it also meant the end of Aqualish self-determination for a while, and it snuffed out the fires of separatism in one of the regions where they had burned the brightest. In 18 BBY, Imperial forces also participated in the Listehol Campaign, a war fought not against a separatist holdout, but against an alliance of outlaws. That year, as the Empire continued to expand into former separatist space, it had reorganized and greatly expanded the corporate sector at the end of the Hydian Way, handing its assets over to loyalist corporations and giving them free reign within the region's borders. From there, the Empire tried to expand into the Trans-Hydian region, which historically had been mostly unclaimed space, but its efforts were hampered by extensive pirate activity. The Zygerian slavers, a former ally of the CIS, had thrived during the Clone Wars, and though the Republic had fought a few battles against them and destroyed their fortress on Kadavo, they still held considerable power in the early years of the Empire. This power dramatically increased after they forged an alliance with the Turvig slavers and the Circadian pirates, carving out a small pocket of territory along the Shaltin tunnels and the Listehol Run, the two main routes across the outer Trans-Hydian. From their respective homeworlds, these pirates began harassing shipping along these two routes, thwarting Imperial expansion into the region. In 18 BBY, they even began attacking the outlying worlds of the corporate sector, prompting an Imperial response. Admiral Wolf Yularen, a hero of the Clone Wars, was tasked with putting down the Zygerian alliance. Yularen and his second-in-command, Captain Banage Holt, were only given a small task force for this operation, just a few Venator-class Star Destroyers and a fleet of ancient Invincible-class heavy cruisers that were on loan from the Corporate Sector Authority. But Yularen was able to augment this fleet with squadrons of brand new TIE fighters, which were enough to allow Imperial forces to make rapid progress in what became the Listehol Campaign. From Listehol itself, Yularen and Holt led their forces down the Listehol Run, clearing out pirates and slavers as they went. They dealt with the Circadians first, fending off a swarm of Circadian ships in the Battle of Sagma before attacking Circud itself. Next, it was the Zygerians' turn. Yularen and Holt led their fleet further down the Listehol Run, smashing Zygerian forces until arriving at Zygeria itself. The Zygerians surrendered and negotiated a peace treaty with the Empire at Blaster Point. This ultimately allowed the Zygerians to continue their slaving operations, but under the supervision of the Empire, which became their main client. With the Circadians crushed and the Zygerians under Imperial control, the Listehol Run was secure and the corporate sector was safe from the outlaws' activities. This allowed the Empire's planned expansion into the Trans-Hydian to resume, but the Turvig slavers were still in business, so the Listehol Campaign continued. Taking Zygeria as a forward operating base, Yularen and Holt pushed down the Shaltin tunnels toward Turvisis, fighting slaver fleets as they went. They defeated several Turvig fleets, but Turvisis itself remained defiant, even in the face of repeated Imperial raids. The Listehol Campaign ultimately ran out of steam and sputtered out, and most of the remaining ships assigned to the operation were handed over to the corporate sector for use in its defense fleet. Turvisis would continue to be a problem until 13 BBY, when, 5 years after the end of the Listehol Campaign, the Empire finally launched a full-scale invasion of the planet, putting down the Turvig for good. The Listehol Campaign was only a partial success, but it secured the borders of the corporate sector, allowing it to grow and become more wealthy than ever before. In time, the Empire would move into the Transidian and claim the region for the Empire, though most of it would, in practice, remain desolate and lawless. By the end of 18 BBY, the Empire had defeated the more powerful Separatist holdouts, reclaimed most of what had once been Separatist space, and was making major headway into expanding its territory in the Outer Rim. Only one region remained problematic: the Western Reaches. This stretch of the galaxy had always been mostly lawless, and the Republic had maintained what territory it had there in name only. During the Clone Wars, General Grievous's campaigns along the Corellian trade spine completely cut the Republic off from the Western Reaches, and it had consequently lost all semblance of control across the whole region. During the Outer Rim sieges, the Republic had made some headway back into the region, establishing a secure border along the Rimmer trade route and pushing down the trade spine to Bomis Kori, a Separatist stronghold that fell to Generals Kenobi and Skywalker in the final months of the war. But most of the region still fell beyond the borders of the Empire, and the Western Reaches had become a haven for the Empire's remaining enemies. In the final days of the Clone Wars, the remnants of General Grievous's armies fled down the trade spine from Bomis Kori, allying with the many pirates and slavers that prowled this portion of the galaxy. For a year and a half after the declaration of a new order, they stubbornly resisted all Imperial encroachment into the Western Reaches. By 17 BBY, these dead-enders were some of the last Separatist holdouts in the galaxy, and Emperor Palpatine himself had become determined to see them crushed. He assigned the task to Grand Moff Tarkin of neighboring Eriadu, and the final stage of the reconquest of the Rim began: the Western Reaches operation. Tarkin, knowing that the forces assigned to his own sector army would be insufficient to take the Western Reaches on their own, asked the Emperor for reinforcements from other units, and Palpatine gave him all he requested and more. Not only did Tarkin take command of a vast task force drawn from units all across the Empire, the Western Reaches Superiority Force, but several of the Empire's new war heroes were assigned to the Western Reaches operation as well. While Tarkin took overall command of the invasion, General Ramodi was sent in to assist with ground operations, while Admiral Screed and Captain Holt took command of Tarkin's naval forces. Other Imperials would become famous for their exploits in the Western Reaches, most notably the pilot Captain Shia Hublin, who became renowned as the Empire's leading fighter ace. These feared Imperial leaders would go up against enemies that were just as ruthless and battle-hardened. Many of the Separatists in the Western Reaches had served under General Grievous himself, participating in his assaults on the core worlds and his merciless raids on the outer Corellian trade spine, and there were quite a few cunning tacticians among them, such as the rogue Aqualish General Kendu Ultho. Their criminal allies weren't to be trifled with either. These most infamously included the Iska pirates and their leader, the pirate lord Gun Cutlax. The enemy was entrenched at Iska, Ogoth Tir, and Toste, and it would not be easy to uproot them. The Western Reaches operation lasted for nearly a whole year, and it captured the imagination of the Imperial public, immortalized in holodramas like the Guns of Kel Rodo I and the Charge at Feather Nebula. These painted the Western Reaches operations as a glorious, enlightened campaign of spreading civilization to a lawless region of space, a clean war in which Imperial heroes triumphed over bloodthirsty Separatist warlords and pirate kings. The truth, of course, was much different. The Western Reaches operations was a bloody slog, and both sides matched one another for ruthlessness. The campaign began with a string of victories for the Empire, which set forth from its bases on the Corellian trade spine to win early victories at Ichtor and Halm, while a task force from Eriadu took Ord Valg. In the Battle of Kel Rodo I, Admiral Screed and Captain Holt trounced the Separatist space forces, before Shea Hublin took down Kelrodo I's planetary shield in a daring attack run on the Citadel of Axes, allowing General Ramodi's ground forces to land and secure a quick victory. From there, Imperial forces advanced and won another major victory in the Battle of Penduxa. Along the trade spine, the Empire won additional victories at the Feather Nebula and at Little Petrovi, where Hublin and Ramodi kept proving themselves to be some of the Empire's best. In the northern theatre of the Western Reaches, things were going well, but the campaign took a turn in the south. At Brindar, Iska pirates disguised as local officials caught Imperial forces in a devastating ambush, and an entire Imperial fleet was routed. Captain Holt was killed and General Ramodi was grievously wounded. But this setback proved temporary. Ramodi, despite having been blinded, would continue to oversee Imperial ground forces from his back-to-tank, and the Empire soon struck back. In the north, Imperial forces took Iska, while in the south, Admiral Screed and Shea Hublin crushed the Iska pirates' main fleet at Funha, forcing Gun Cutlax to flee the Separatist strongholds in the remote Atravis sector. Screed and Hublin pursued, and their task force wiped out what remained of the Iska pirates in the Battle of Toste, in which Gun Cutlax was killed at last. That just left General Ultho's Separatist holdout forces, which were defeated not long after in the Battle of Ogoth Tir. Kendu Ultho was ultimately killed as well, and his remaining forces were crushed. With their leaders gone, the remaining Separatists in the Western Reaches were quickly destroyed by the Empire, which expanded rapidly across the region, pushing its borders as far west as Syria. While the cost of their campaign was high, the Western Reaches operation was ultimately a dramatic success for the Empire, the biggest victory of the reconquest of the Rim. By the end of 17 BBY, the last of the Separatists had been dispersed, and the only Separatist holdouts that remained were a few minor remote systems which largely kept to themselves. There would be occasional spurts of Separatist activity in the years that followed, including a campaign against a reactivated Droid army led by the Geonosian Gizor Delso a few years after the end of the Western Reaches operation. For the most part though, the Separatist cause was dead. With the end of the Western Reaches operation in late 17 BBY, the reconquest of the Rim was over and the Empire had triumphed. The death of separatism in the reconquest of the Rim solidified the Empire's position as the dominant power in the galaxy, eliminating the only remaining organized opposition to it, at least for a time. For the next 15 years, the Empire would be all but unchallenged, free to expand further until it controlled almost all of known space, which it would brutally enforce its will upon. The dark times truly began with the end of the reconquest of the Rim, and the remaining anti-imperial factions in the galaxy would have to undertake many long years of planning before they had a shot at finally unseating the Empire. This wasn't just because of the Empire's strategic victory in the reconquest of the Rim. The campaign had also been a massive propaganda victory. The war allowed the Empire to frame itself as a force for order, and it won over people all across the galaxy by wiping out pirates, slavers, and the remnants of the Separatists. The campaign as a whole served as proof to many loyalists that Emperor Palpatine could, as he had promised in the Declaration of a New Order, bring safety, security, justice, and peace, and it would take many long years of Imperial oppression for the people of the galaxy to begin to see through those lies. The reconquest of the Rim set the tone for the entire Imperial era, providing justification for the Empire's existence and shaping how the Empire's people thought about its place in the galaxy on a very fundamental level. If it weren't for this campaign, the Empire might not have lasted as long as it did. The Clone Wars may have provided the foundation for the Empire, but they alone weren't enough to make it stable. The reconquest of the Rim was what ensured the Empire would reign supreme during the dark times. It also helped the Empire rewrite the history of the Clone Wars somewhat. The Imperial officers that oversaw the reconquest of the Rim replaced the Jedi in the minds of the public as the great war heroes of the fight against the Separatists, and Imperial propagandists retroactively revised the history of the Clone Wars to minimize the efforts of the Jedi in favor of these newly minted Imperial legends. The stories of the Clone Wars and the reconquest of the Rim blended together, becoming one grand tale of the rise of the New Order, a great crusade that built the Empire and laid low its enemies. There was a reason the rebellion didn't really take off until after the rise of a generation that didn't really remember either war. Entire generations before them had had their views of the galaxy warped by Imperial narratives of the Clone Wars and its aftermath, and it would take extensive rebel propaganda efforts during the Galactic Civil War to deprogram them. So that's our look at the reconquest of the Rim, the epilogue of the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Would you like to see more stories set during this period of the Empire fighting the Separatists? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.